Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I hope that you had a good weekend. Pretty much my whole career, one of the most difficult questions I had to answer is what exactly is it that you do? When I came out of college, I worked as a consultant for a company called Anderson Consulting. It's now known as Accenture. I was there a very long time. And our original marketing tagline was something along the lines of, we help our clients change to be more successful. But what are you actually doing? And people would always say that at work, people I worked with, they would always say the hardest part about your job is explaining to your parents what it is you actually do all day, because it's not very obvious what a consultant actually does, particularly when you're talking to someone who's in the tangible world for a living. For a while, a short period of time, I did work for a phone company. So working for the phone company, people know what a phone company is. Of course, we didn't call it the phone company. We said we were a CLEC, a competitive local exchange carrier, other things of that nature. And then, when I left the kind of IT and management consulting world behind and went into sort of urban policy, again, people were not really sure exactly what it is that I do. And to be honest, I'm still not sure I can easily articulate everything today that I do, but I wanted to anchor back to what I'm all about in the work that I'm doing and some of the guiding principles that I have. So I know some people are new. Some people discovered me years ago. Some people discovered me through my work in urbanism. Other people discovered me through my work on sort of men's issues. Other people discovered me through my First Things article in the Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. So a lot of people are coming at this from maybe different perspectives and may not have heard some of the things that I laid out before. Because when I first started writing my newsletter, I went through a whole series of guiding principles that I have, but probably most of you did not go back to newsletter 5 or whichever one I started writing about that because I'm now up to something like 67 in the newsletter count. So I wanted to just anchor on a few things. And I was also inspired a bit by the Benham brothers when they reached out to me after I wrote my Three Worlds of Evangelicalism piece. We had a great conversation. And in fact, we had a good video podcast with them, which you can go look up on the YouTube channel. And they sent me one of their books, which was a business book. And, they had a few things in there. And I kind of like, hey, some of this stuff is just basics, but it's basics I hadn't really been doing. I didn't really have a good, crisp kind of elevator speech or mission statement about what I'm doing. So I spent a little bit of time just trying to think about some of these things, wrote them down. So I just want to share this for you to just kind of anchor everybody in what I'm all about and in the way that I seek to conduct myself and do my work here. And so every corporation seems to have a mission statement. And so, Aaron, what is your mission? What is your vision? Whatever you want to say. I don't know that it's per se corporate, but the way I've sort of alighted on describing it is that, my mission is to become a leading public intellectual so that through my speaking and writing, I can help conservative American Christians successfully adapt to the 21st century. So yes, I want to accomplish something for myself, but the purpose of that is to help other people adapt to this new world. Now, that's not the totality and the sum of every single thing that I do. I also do work that's maybe related to conservatives in general, not particularly religious conservatives. I may be doing work that has nothing to do with conservatives whatsoever, which is just more purely policy focused, could even be described, in some cases, maybe as more progressive leaning, for example, in the sense that, for example, I'm very pro public transit in a lot of ways, which other people aren't. But sort of my core, what I'm trying to do is help a group of people who've been struggling in a lot of ways to make a successful adaptation to a radically different world. And so that's really sort of the North Star of what I'm all about. And in doing that, I want to embody certain personal values that I have. Honesty, fairness, independence, rigor, excellence, and authenticity. I'll talk a little bit more about honesty when I talk about the guiding principles. One of the things that I do in my work and really seek to do is to be fair. When I criticize people, I want it to be a criticism that's fair and it's not just a a straw man or something that's a purely rhetorical attack that doesn't have substance about it, or one that doesn't recognize the totality of that person's work, maybe some of the good things that they've done. What I always say is, I like to acknowledge the good people do, while also not being afraid, to call out, kind of the bad that people do from time to time. And I want to be willing to make critiques of even the biggest names out there, but in a way that's fair to them. It is not just about trying to cut them down or score some rhetorical points or taking advantage of an inartfully phrased sentence or blog post in order to start piling on or pounding them or something like that. I want to be fair. And that's not to say that I won't use rhetoric. I think it's completely valid to use rhetoric. There's no problem with using rhetoric. That's not to say that I'm going to write a thorough biography of everyone that I talk about and cover every single nuance. No, but I want to be fair. And I want that to be one of the points, that I really am fair and I'm trying to present things in a way that the average person can look at and say, hey, even if I don't agree with this, I see where this guy's coming from. I see that he has a point. Independence, nobody is truly independent, and independence is a blessing and a curse. But one of the things that I also want to be able to do is not be so totally tied to movements or institutions such that it compromises my ability to speak on things. And again, I love institutions, and I'm happy to be affiliated with an institution, American Reformer. I was very glad to have worked for Accenture and the Manhattan Institute and others of that nature. I like being part of institutions. And there are always going to be things that put constraints on you. For example, it's just me as a consultant speaking. I mean, a lot of people don't operate this way. I feel like anybody who's been a client of mine in the past is not somebody or that I want to talk about in a negative way publicly if I can at all avoid it. And I also apply that to former employers. I apply that to churches that I've attended, things of that nature. Just the way that I am, I don't like to do that. I like to treat people with, I think there's a certain obligation there, right? That when, somebody's been your customer and you're doing things for them, then, that comes with obligations to them, confidentiality, etc. And that's not to say, again, that there's not a place for blowing the whistle. For example, if you come across examples of malfeasance or something of that nature, or maybe there's some deep, dark secret that does need to be exposed, you could do that. But as a general rule, I don't like to do that sort of stuff. And so that's why I like to be cautious, about the things that I do in order to avoid compromising, my ability to speak on certain points. And in some cases, you can say that's strategic. In other cases, it's a matter of just happenstance and that how my life sort of worked out. So one reason that I'm free to criticize the Republican Party in Indiana so heavily is because I never did anything with the Republican Party in Indiana, and they never did anything with me. And so although I worked for a think tank, you call a conservative think tank, and I have some connections in the New York world and the D.C. world and places like that, really, nobody here in Indiana and kind of the Republican world, they never gave me a job. They never did anything like that. Ergo, I had no real obligation to them, and that gave me the opportunity to talk in a way that I would not otherwise have done. So I try to think about independence as a variable while realizing that being too independent is not necessarily a good thing. I did a previous podcast where I said, it would be good for me to be something like 75% independent, 25% institutional, or maybe 2/3 independent, one-third institutional. Because being engaged in institutions and being with other people keep you grounded and keep you anchored in the real world. If you're too independent, then you're too detached from reality, because the real world is everybody has to compromise. Everybody has to come together. And so one of the nice things about the institutions that I'm working with, like American Reformer, is we're all very like-minded in a lot of ways. And so therefore, their support, it's very supportive of what I'm doing, while also giving me kind of a group of people that can help keep me accountable. So I like to try to think about independence as something to do so that I don't end up in a situation where, like, why you can't ever say anything about anybody because you're part of this, nexus of people, and your career would be over if you ever stepped out of line. And that's how it works in a lot of places, unfortunately. In some of these denominations, in some of these movements, you kind of got to be a company man. And if you're not a company man, then your career could be in jeopardy. And a lot of people have to watch what they say in order to protect their career. And maybe I'm just less thoughtful of my career than I should be or something. But, independence is important. And again, rigor, I want to be rigorous. I want to write things that are solid and such. Now, again, the key is this is genre dependent. I've always said the podcast is like talk radio. This is talk radio banter. It's at one level. A blog post is another level. My monthly newsletter is another level. An article in First Things magazine or another major publication, that's got to have like a lot of rigor behind it. You get to doing a book, it's got to be at the more higher level even than that. So the amount of rigor and sort of footnoting and things like that you put into something is going to, in part, depend on the genre. But relative to the genre that I'm operating in, I want to do a good job there. I want to say things that aren't just like half-cocked, whatever, but also, are appropriate. I don't want to say, you have to have like 65 journal entries that you're cross-referencing before you can ever say anything. That's not true. And again, some of what I do, I think, isn't what you would call scientific paper level, but because I'm very transparent about what I'm saying and doing, it's perfectly appropriate. So a lot of times I just make observations. I say, I see this, I see this, I see this, which to me indicate this, that, and the other thing. And so it's not here's a syllogism that logically proves something, but what it does do is calibrates the amount of claim that I'm making to the amount of evidence that I have. So that's one of the things that I do. Excellence is, again, something that I want to do. I want to raise the bar and be really good at what I do. I want to put out really good material. I don't think right now, for example, that my podcast excellence is really at the level I would like it to be. I'm not necessarily a natural on camera or in the audio mechanism. I lend myself much more to the written word. So this is an area where I want to be continuously improving to get better. Or maybe just say, hey, maybe that's something that is just going to always be niche or minor for me because it's something I can't. But I do have to think about how can we be excellent at what we do. Excellence is important. I want to do work that is game-changing, in part because it is just at that level of excellence, rigor, etc. that's there. And then authenticity is an important one. And this is one that I struggle with. And this is another reason that I really did this podcast this week. There's an article in yesterday's, such as to say, the Sunday New York Times, and it was about Scott Galloway. So Scott Galloway is a marketing professor at NYU. And I think the title here is Scott Galloway, the Howard Stern of the business world. And I've linked to Galloway a number of times in his videos. He's hilarious. And, he's what works today. Hyper-opinionated, over-the-top statements, Silicon Valley style disruption, overturning the existing order, calling these people, frauds and no good, talking about this, that, and the other thing, spoken with hyper-confidence. This is what sells. These sorts of provocative, kind of extreme takes on the world. And if you look at this article, like one of the things you will see is that he predicted that Amazon would buy Whole Foods. Apparently he went on TV or something and he's like, Amazon, the logical move for them is to buy Whole Foods. And like 4 days later, they did. So it's like, whoa, this guy's amazing. But what you don't see is all the predictions and all the things that he said that didn't turn out. And you see the same thing with Scott Adams. I know a lot of people follow Scott Adams, the cartoonist who did Dilbert online. Scott Adams, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in a previous election predicted that Herman Cain, is that his name? Herman Cain was going to win the Republican nomination. He's for sure the master of persuasion. He's so good. Of course, nobody remembers they did that. They remember that he predicted that Trump was going to be elected in something like August 2015 or some crazy thing. And so the way that the social media world works is it rewards people for making these sorts of extreme takes. Just go out there and make very provocative, high-risk predictions. A handful of them come true, and you've made your reputation. Everybody forgets all the ones that you made that didn't come true. You don't seem to lose anything for making claims that turn out to not be true. You can just continue being provocative, just continue moving on to the next thing, have no fear, and that's what you get. And again, very extreme political takes, very in your face, high conflict, all those things. That's what sells. And frankly, that would be something that would be better for me probably to embrace in order to build my audience. Going back to about a year ago, I think it was September, October of last year, my Twitter following had been stagnant for years, like 5 years, 7 years, something like that. It was crazy, that I'd sort of given up, that Twitter was ever going to grow again. And in the past, I'd really grown a nice little following. I had almost, 21,000 followers or something. I can't remember exactly what it was, slightly less than 21,000. And I said, I'm going to turn up the temperature on my Twitter account by about 10 to 20%. I'm going to increase the provocation level 10 to 20%. And wouldn't you know, my follower count started growing again. My engagement level started going up because that's what people like. And this happened, by the way, this is one of the ways that I know that Twitter really does throttle people and shadow ban them, whatever you want to call it. I call it throttling, because I think that's really a better way to do it. Within a month of my turning up the temperature on my Twitter, the number of average impressions per tweet that I was getting fell by 2/3 to 3/4 almost overnight. You could almost see someone flipping a switch or turning a dial. Of course, it may have been an algorithm as well. It may not have been a human that said, boom, we're throttling you. We're going to dramatically reduce the number of people who see each tweet that you send. And I thought that was very interesting. So they detected something they didn't like in what I was doing, and they said, we're going to throttle you, which is one reason that it's much harder to build a Twitter following than it used to be. There's guys who, back in 2015 or or 2014, if a guy like Richard Hanania, for those of you who see him on Twitter, if you're Twitter users, you may come across Richard Hanania, a guy like that would have 500,000 followers by now. Well, instead, he's got like 50,000 because they really make it difficult for people to use those techniques to build followings like you used to, even when you have people that have really excellent Twitter game, so to speak. But the point is, that's not the way that I want to do business. That's not what my strengths are. I think writing a 4,000-word essay with 7 points explaining why on something and methodically walking through people through the process and trying to be fair and trying to be substantive and all of this stuff is really more where I'm at. And so I have to recognize that in some respects that hobbles my ability to grow a massive audience because it's not the red meat that people want. Now, what I also don't want to do is use that as an excuse and say, well, Aaron, you would be 25 times as big as you are, but you're just too good to do what it would take. You can very easily turn into an excuse. I'm not using that as an excuse. I'm planning to grow and succeed by being authentic to who I am. That's not in any way an admission to defeat, but I'm not going to take those cheap routes to try to get rich. Now, as I said, with Twitter, I think that there is a place for me to say, hey, Aaron, maybe the way that you've been doing it really isn't the way you should be doing it. You should be turning up the temperature a little bit. You should be a little more strident in some cases. You should be a little more aggressive. I need to do that, but I want to do it in a way that's authentic and congruent to who I am, because I'm not a bomb thrower, by nature. Occasionally, something gets me upset, and I post things that people say are provocative, but I want to, really think about how I talk about things in a substantive way. So I'm about to write an article later this afternoon. I started in on it, talking about the Indiana abortion law and the announcement by the largest corporation, Indianapolis, Eli Lilly, that they are decide they're going to look elsewhere outside the state of Indiana to expand in the future. And so I'm going to go through a lot of details on that and a lot of nuance, and probably it's not the sort of thing that would please anybody, because they would probably want me to try to give them a smackdown or something of that nature. Or of course, if you're the left, it's like, oh, you got to like rip these horrible hayseed Republican theocrats, whatever. That's the sort of thing that gets people going. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, hey, actually some of these laws may have a business impact, but the impact is much more marginal than you might think. And let's go through some of the details. Hey, I just got a quote here on the stream from Thomas. My pastor quotes your articles from time to time. Thank you for sharing that, because that's one of the things that I want to do. I want to create material that people feel comfortable, sharing, with anybody. That it's like real stuff. It's not just, bomb throwing, red meat, stuff like that. So that's one of the things I'm doing. I got to figure out how to be authentic to myself while not engaging in limiting beliefs. But I think trying to make sure that I'm not doing things that are way outside the lines of what I want to, of how I want to be as a person, how I want to engage for clicks. I think that's important, because I've seen many, many people on social media get knocked off their center and end up going to a place that they never imagined they would go because of the toxic incentive structures of social media. You get the rewards, you get the food pellet, right, for pressing the flame war button, you get rewarded for doing certain things, and those compromises and things you might do. For some people, there is no compromise. That's just who they are. For others, it's like, wow, they end up in a place they didn't want to go. So that's it. So those are just some of the values that I want to get it. And then I want to go through the guiding principles, which I think are very important. And the most important one for me, and I've written about these in the newsletter, by the way, live not by lies. Interesting that Dreher chose this as the title for his book. It's actually an essay, famous essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, is, look, you can be in this Orwellian ideological state, but you have to find a way to avoid becoming complicit in falsehood and lies. And of course, he served time in the Gulag and many, many other things on account of that, which hopefully will never happen to us. But so often today, we see people who are unwilling to say the truth. We know things are true, but we say the publicly acceptable thing. And this isn't just a religious thing, by the way. This is, everything that's going on. So, for example, we will talk about every, aspect of race. May all actually be true, but we're going to neglect disparities in who commits crime, and we're just going to pretend like that doesn't exist. And we're going to studiously avoid commenting on it. And, that only provides the space. There's a great Steven Pinker video on this. Like, that only provides the space for other people to come in and start saying true things that nobody else will say, and they will credentialize themselves, but those probably aren't the people that we want leading our society. So we need to have the courage to speak the truth, to discern the truth, to align the way we live our lives with the truth, and to speak the truth in a contextually appropriate way. I do think that how we communicate truth is also very important. Dare I say, we should seek to be winsome in most cases. I don't typically use that term, but since it's the buzzword du jour, I'll take it out. And an old mentor of mine who was a strategy partner at Accenture, he talked about strategy projects. And he said every strategy project is made up of 3 components, each which is about a third of the work. A third of the work is figuring out what the real problem is. A third of the work is figuring out the solution. And a third of the work is figuring out how to communicate it. Figuring out how to communicate the truth is really important. And a lot of what I do is actually not discovering a huge amount of new facts that nobody ever knew before. A lot of what I'm doing is taking, frankly, very well-known facts, or certainly things that are well established, if not necessarily that widely known, and figuring out how can I articulate this in a way that the average person who's never heard this before is going to think it's like a sane thing to say, and that it's not just provocative, that it's not just being said to create dissension, disturbances, etc. So I think communicating is important, but we can't be all rhetoric. We have to actually have the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And one of the things I noted in a separate one, I kind of articulated this as a separate principle, but I didn't write it down here, is you'll see people today, and this is a go-to move I recognize in people now. They make collections of statements that are all individually true, very carefully crafted and phrased, that invite you to draw conclusions that are not explicitly stated in the text. That's one thing. Or invite you to believe that the speaker believes something that he never quite actually says he believes. And in fact, you may have evidence he actually doesn't believe that. He may believe the opposite. So it's this way of essentially misleading through the truth. And living not by lies means not being willing, being willing to not do things like that either. We really have to focus on truth. It's very important. A second one for me is to build up, not just tear down. I learned this by studying the work of an old Christian manosphere blogger named Dalrock. Lots of you know Dalrock. When I was starting out writing a lot about men's issues, people would say, Aaron, you know Dalrock? You ever heard of Dalrock? I go, yeah, I've read Dalrock's entire blog. In fact, I have a copy of it sitting on my hard drive because he threatened to delete it one time. But think about Dalrock, he was just totally relentlessly negative. He never had a good word to say about anybody or anything, basically. And as a result, you sort of get tuned out. And so, yes, I want to critique. In fact, this week, I'm probably going to write more critiques than I've written in a long time. But I want to be sure to be giving positive, useful information. And that's one reason that if you go through my corpus, you'll see me talk about things like posture and eye contact and things like that. Things that I've had to work on and still need to work on, things that I'm working on. Not because I'm the biggest genius of those things. Sometimes those essays didn't necessarily get the biggest response. But I want to make very clear, and I want to make it clear not just by what I say, but through the pattern of my work, that I have a positive agenda. I don't just have a negative agenda. I'm here to build people up. I'm here to help people move forward. I'm here to give practical, actionable insight, not just to give a bunch of critiques of something. So I think this idea of building up, not just tearing down, is important. And of course, we're working on institutions. I don't want to just tear down institutions, although I think there's a lot of institutions to be torn down. How can we find institutions that can be strengthened? How can we create new institutions like American Reformer? How can we do things like that? Building up is important, not just tearing down. Third part, again, I took this from Nassim Taleb, have skin in the game. I don't want to tell people to do things I'm not doing myself. Sometimes I will give people, I'm not going to call it advice. Here's something you might do according to this person over here. I haven't done that. Now, I'll sometimes pass along information that I haven't personally done. Hey, I heard some people had good luck with this. You might want to check that out. And I don't like to give direct advice in any case because I've got plenty of advice in the past that, although it was actually excellent advice, turned out horribly for me. And I'm like, man, I don't want to be in that position again. But what I'll say is, when I talk about X, Y, or Z, is this something that I'm doing or have done? That's important. I want to have skin in the game here. I don't want to just tell people to do things when I'm not willing to be doing them. So I really want to be somebody who models that. I want my life and what I'm doing to be congruent with what I'm saying. Fourth, and this one very important to me, provide compelling insight people cannot get anywhere else. you were not going to get the three worlds of evangelical analysis anywhere but from me. I'm providing content that either you never would have found or you wouldn't have heard it in a certain way. I want to be a source of original insight or original presentation or something that makes me a go-to site because I'm giving you something you cannot get anywhere else. There may be other people who are doing great stuff. I'm not saying you wouldn't want to do other people's things as well. I think you should, but I want to set that bar for myself. I don't want to just be, another Me Too kind of guy here. Oh yeah, I'll repeat the same thing everybody else is repeating. I'll make the talking points. I'll argue this and that. I want to provide things that you can't get anywhere else that are deep, insightful, actionable for people to really be able to navigate this world. Next level insight is what I want to be able to give people. You can't get anywhere else. And then lastly, number 5 is what I call pay it forward. I would not be where I am today if it had not been for other people giving me a hand up. I've told the story before in my urban work that it was Joel Kotkin who introduced me to the editor of City Journal, Brian Anderson, ultimately led to my having a job there. I was going to shut my newsletter down after 1 year because it did not meet my readership targets. I said, I'll give it a year by word of mouth. If it doesn't spread by word of mouth to X 100, 500 subscribers, then I'm going to shut it down. I had something like 268 subscribers after 1 year. I'm like, I'm shutting it down. No big deal. It was an experiment. It failed. Rod Dreher picked up one of my articles. It was actually my original version of my Three Worlds piece. Sent it out to his list. Sent me like 1,500 subscribers, 2,000 subscribers within a week. Okay, so guys like Dreher, like Mark Galley, like Doug Wilson, touting what I'm doing are key to what I'm doing. It's very, very, very difficult to organically build an audience without some sort of outside help. I mean, I should talk a lot about that, quite frankly, because it's a whole other topic, but don't ever make the mistake of thinking that most of what you see on the internet is truly organic. It's not. And so to the extent that I continue to grow and get bigger, it's going to be in part because people with bigger platforms, bigger audiences, bigger reputations than me decide to shine a spotlight on me and my work and help bring me up. The fact that First Things magazine published my Three Worlds article made a huge difference. So Rusty and the team there really let me be part of that institution, which has such a great brand and such a great reach, and creates a compelling environment for me to say something that can't be ignored. It gives a different level of impact than it does just on my own newsletter. So, I need people like that. And so because I need that and because I received that, I want to do that for other people. And I certainly see online, those who, they help other people or they're all about themselves. And I want to be somebody that helps other people. And that's why a guy like Joel Kotkin is a mensch because he doesn't need me for anything. Yes, is it nice for me to have content that he can go up on his site? Of course, there's a few small things, but he's a guy who's rarely reached down to people at lower levels than him and said, let me give you a consulting project. Let me feature you. And again, I'm not saying it's all 100% selfless. He's getting something out of it, obviously, at some level too, but he's passed people along. And I want to be able to say, who are the other people that are out there that I can give a hand up to? And that's one reason when people ask me to come on their podcast, I almost always say yes. I've been the first guest on a number of people's podcasts they've ever had. I'm not looking at how many downloads you have. I want to say yes as much as possible to other people who ask me to appear on their podcast, or how can I showcase someone's work, if it's worthy too. It's got to be good. I don't want to just shine a light on something just because I want it to be good, but I want to find those people that I can give the next step up to, because of, what I've received for others, because nobody makes it unless you get a hand up from other people. So that's what I want to do. I want to be part of bringing up a next generation of people under me. That's where I feel like a lot of, a lot of the boomers fell short. Some of them did phenomenal jobs, others didn't. But I think that's something to look at for people. You use that as a filter when you're evaluating other people. Is that other person someone who builds up smaller, less prestigious voices? Do they recommend them? Or do they spend all time sort of networking up, trying to get on shows, trying to get on Rogan, trying to speak only to their peers and their buddies? That's an interesting insight, I think, into people's personality to say, what are these people doing? So, I look at a guy like Keller, he's doing the New Yorker, he's doing his thing, but what else is he doing? He's writing a foreword for Jake Meador's book. Okay, he didn't need to do that, right? He didn't have to do something like that. Jake's book was probably not going to be a bestseller. It was a debut book. Says something to his character that he's willing to go out and do something like that for a guy like that in a public way. I like to look for people who are doing those things because it says something positive. I don't want to think about necessarily dinging the people who aren't doing it. I want to think about wow, that says something about people's character when you see them doing things for the smaller names. So anyhow, that's a little bit of what I wanted to go through. I just wanted to go through, again, what I'm all about, some of the values I want to do, and again, my guiding principles, which since I didn't drain that list initially, I'll just drain it now. I want to live not by lies. I want to build up, not just tear down. I want to have skin in the game. I want to give original, compelling insights that you can't give anywhere else, and I want to pay it forward by building up next generation, new talent up under me in the same way that the people above me have helped pull me up. And I'm going to continue to be dependent on that to grow over time. So thank you for listening. Hopefully some of this stuff can make you think a little bit about, what you want to be. You're probably not going to pick the same list of things I picked. I'm not saying do these things because I did them. You might. I borrow kind of things from people all the time. But I say, can you describe what your mission is? What are some of the values that you hold? And maybe what are some of the guiding principles that you have that animate your work. And nice thing about guiding principles, and the nice thing about some of these is they can be actionable. When you're thinking about writing a blog post about X, Y, or Z, you can say, does this embody the things that I wrote down that I said I'm all about? Sometimes the answer is no, and you do it anyway. But I think otherwise it can help maybe put some guardrails on what you're doing. And by no means am I going to say that I am perfect, that I always embody every single one of these values. I'm not perfect. I got a long way to go. I'm getting better every day, as I say. But this is some of what I aspire to do and just bringing this unique insight, truth at a level of rigor with skin in the game, excellent, authentic, every day, continuing to do it and help other people along the way. So thank you very much for listening. Next week, I think is going to be my monthly newsletter, which is going to be on aesthetics. It's a guest post. I really think this is an important essay. Some of these essays that other people write don't get the same reaction. This is one that will, in my view, be rewarded. You'll be rewarded if you ponder what it says and think about it. Important things will help challenge us in our managerial way of thinking. So I'll tease that, and I will talk to you in the not too distant future.